I never expected that night to change anything. It was supposed to be simple, just two friends, a bottle of whiskey, and the dull ache of heartbreak hanging between us. The air outside was heavy with the scent of rain, the kind that lingers after a storm has passed but still threatens to return. Street lights cast a golden glow through the apartment window, their flickering reflections dancing over the half-empty glass on the coffee table. The place felt smaller than usual, as if the walls had crept in overnight. Daniel sat across from me, slumped against the armrest of my worn-out couch. His dark hair was a mess, probably from running his hands through it too many times. His fingers tapped absently against the rim of his glass, the ice inside melting into a swirl of amber. He hadn't said much in the last few minutes, just stared at the floor like it held all the answers he was looking for. I don't know, man, he finally muttered, voice hoarse from all the talking we'd already done. I thought she loved me. I nodded, even though he wasn't looking at me. I knew that pain too well. The way love could unravel so quickly, leaving behind nothing but questions that never had satisfying answers. You'll be okay, I said, meaning it. It just takes time. He scoffed, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Yeah? And what the hell am I supposed to do until then? The question hung in the air between us, heavier than it should have been. I wanted to reach out, to squeeze his shoulder, to tell him he wasn't alone, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way his eyes met mine, then, just for a second, searching for something I wasn't sure I could give. Or maybe it was the way my pulse quickened, a reaction I told myself was just sympathy. Outside, thunder rumbled low in the distance. The storm hadn't passed after all, and deep down, I knew neither had something else. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, not exactly, but it wasn't normal either. Daniel let out a deep sigh and leaned back against the couch, his head lolling to the side as he stared up at the ceiling. It just sucks, giving everything to someone and still not being enough. I swallowed hard. I knew that feeling too well, though for different reasons. You were enough, I said, keeping my voice steady. She just didn't see it. He huffed out a laugh, dry and humorless. Then why do I feel like the biggest idiot in the world right now? I didn't have an answer for that. Instead, I reached for the bottle between us, pouring another glass. He watched me, his eyes flickering to my hand, then back to my face. When I handed him the drink, our fingers brushed, just for a second, just long enough for my breath to hitch in my throat. I ignored it. I had to. Daniel downed half the glass in one go, then wiped at his mouth with the back of his hand. I don't even know how to be single anymore, he admitted. It's like I spent so long trying to be the guy she wanted, I forgot how to just be me. I forced a chuckle. You? Not knowing how to be you? That's a first. He smirked, shaking his head. I'm serious, man. Who even am I without her? The question wasn't meant for me, but it hit something deep. I'd asked myself that same thing too many times, except in my case, it was never about a girl. It was about the way I'd spent years pretending to be someone I wasn't, hiding behind friendships like this one, convincing myself that the things I felt didn't matter, that the way I looked at Daniel didn't matter. I took a slow sip of my drink, forcing the thoughts away. He was hurting. That was all this was. But then he turned his head, looking at me like he wanted me to say something, like he was waiting for it. And that look did something to me. I cleared my throat and stood up, needing distance. You're still you, I said, walking toward the kitchen. Relationships don't change that, don't they? His voice followed me, quieter this time, because I feel like I lost something, and I don't even know if I can get it back. I busied myself at the sink, rinsing out my glass even though it didn't need it. The cold water ran over my hands, grounding me. I needed grounding, because something in the air had shifted. When I turned back, Daniel was watching me from the couch, his gaze unreadable. The tension was new, thick and unspoken, pressing against my chest like a weight. I laughed, trying to break it. Wow, you get philosophical when you're drunk. Daniel didn't smile. Instead, he sat forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You ever feel like that? He asked. I frowned. Like what? Like you're missing something. Every muscle in my body tensed. This conversation was going places it shouldn't. I forced another laugh, shaking my head. We're getting way too deep for a Saturday night. Daniel didn't let it go. I mean it. You ever feel like there's something inside you that you don't understand? The question hit too close. I kept my expression neutral as I walked back to the living room. Everyone feels that way sometimes. Yeah, he said, voice softer now. But I feel it right now. I stopped in my tracks. He wasn't looking at me anymore. His gaze was on his drink, swirling the liquid absently. I don't know why I'm saying all this, he admitted, rubbing a hand over his face. Maybe I'm just tired. Or maybe, he trailed off, exhaling sharply. I don't know. I sat down carefully, leaving space between us. I shouldn't ask. I should let it go. But I didn't. Maybe what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated. And then, quietly, he said, maybe I was never supposed to be with her in the first place. The word sent a chill through me. I stared at him, searching for meaning in his face, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. A part of me wanted to brush it off, to laugh, to make a joke, to pretend I hadn't heard what I thought I heard. But another part of me, the part I'd spent years trying to ignore, couldn't let it go. What do you mean? I asked, careful. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. Forget it. I should have. I should have let him drown it in whiskey and regret and never bring it up again. But I couldn't. Not when something in my chest was pounding so loudly I could barely breathe. I licked my lips, my mouth suddenly dry. Daniel. He finally looked at me then, and something passed between us. Something real and unspoken and dangerous. And suddenly, the space between us felt smaller. Too small. My heart was racing, and I knew this was the moment to walk away. To laugh it off. To let it die here, in the dim light of my apartment, drowned out by whiskey and heartbreak and the storm still raging outside. But I didn't move, and neither did he. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. And then, slowly, hesitantly, Daniel reached for my hand. His fingers hovered over mine, just barely, like he wasn't sure if he meant to do it or if his body had moved on its own. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air between us had thickened, charged with something neither of us was ready to name. My heart pounded so hard it hurt, every beat filling the silence between us, between the breaths we weren't taking. I could feel the heat of his skin, the slight tremble in his hand. A single inch, maybe less, that was all the space that remained. But that inch was everything. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. Daniel. I started, but the word barely made it out, shaky and unsure. He looked up at me then, really looked at me. His dark eyes held something I couldn't define, something raw and vulnerable and dangerous. And then, just like that, his fingers closed around mine. A small, simple touch, but it sent a current through me so sharp, so intense, I almost pulled away. Almost. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We just sat there, frozen in that moment, our hands barely touching, but touching enough. Enough for me to feel the warmth of his skin, the slow and deliberate press of his thumb against the back of my hand. My stomach twisted. This was wrong, wasn't it? I had spent years convincing myself that my feelings didn't matter, that I would never, could never have this. And yet, here he was, holding my hand like it meant something, like he needed it, like he needed me. I exhaled, the breath shuddering out of me. Dan, what are you doing? He didn't answer. Instead, his grip tightened, just slightly, just enough to keep me there. And then his other hand lifted, hesitant, slow, unsure, and brushed against my jaw. A feather-light touch, barely there, but it burned. My eyes fluttered shut for half a second before I forced them open. I should pull away. I should say something. But I didn't. Instead, I let him touch me. His fingers skimmed over the edge of my jaw, tracing the roughness of stubble, the line of my cheekbone. I felt his breath before I saw how close he had gotten, warm and uneven. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. A lump formed in my throat. Dan. And then he kissed me. Not a desperate kiss. Not forceful or practiced. Just soft. Searching. Hesitant. Like he wasn't sure if he was allowed. Like he wasn't sure if he wanted me to stop him. I didn't. My breath hitched as his lips brushed mine again. A question more than a statement. My hands trembled as I reached for him, unsure, hesitant, mirroring his own uncertainty. But the moment our fingers locked together, something inside him broke. The kiss deepened, not rough, not aggressive, but urgent. Like he was chasing something he didn't understand. Like he was afraid of what it meant, but more afraid of letting it go. I felt his hands slide to my shoulders, gripping, grounding. I could taste the whiskey on his lips, the remnants of heartbreak on his breath. He exhaled against my mouth, and I swallowed the sound, lost in the storm of him. His warmth, his weight, his hesitation and urgency tangled together in something that shouldn't be happening. And yet, neither of us stopped it. Not when he pressed closer. Not when his fingers curled into the fabric of my shirt. Not when his body trembled, and he pulled back just slightly, just enough to whisper my name like it meant something. Like I meant something. But then, he froze. His breathing was sharp, erratic, his hands still clutching at my shirt like he couldn't decide whether to pull me closer or push me away. "Shit," he whispered. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just watched him, watched the way his eyes flickered, the way his jaw tightened, the way he suddenly looked terrified. And I knew he wasn't ready for this. "Dan, He shook his head, stepping back, away, breaking the contact so fast it felt like a slap. "I don't." The words died in his throat. He looked at me, looked through me. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me there, alone, with nothing but the ghost of his touch still burning on my skin. The door didn't slam behind him. It should have. It should have crashed shut, sealing off whatever had just happened, making it clear that it was a mistake, an accident, a drunken lapse in judgment. But it didn't. Instead, Daniel left the door half open as he walked out. Like even in his panic, he couldn't bring himself to fully close the space between us. Like part of him wanted to stay. I sat there, staring at the empty spot where he had been, my breath still uneven, my hands still clenched in a fist against my thighs. The warmth of his touch hadn't faded yet, but already the cold was creeping in. I had spent years imagining what it might be like, to have something real, something undeniable. And for the briefest moment, I had it. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. The rain started up again outside, soft at first, then heavier, pounding against the windows like a reminder that the storm had never really ended. Neither had this. I stood up, running a hand over my face, trying to ground myself in something real. But this had been real. The way he touched me, the way he kissed me, the way he looked at me before he left. And that was the part that terrified me most. Because if it was real, then what happens now? Daniel didn't text the next day, or the day after that. I told myself to give him space. He needed time to figure out whatever it was that had pushed him toward me that night, and whatever had scared him away. But as the days turned into a week, then two, silence settled between us like a weight. I caught myself checking my phone too often, scrolling through old messages, wondering if I should be the one to reach out, if I should pretend nothing had happened, or if I should force us to talk about it. Neither option felt right. So I waited, until I couldn't anymore. It was a Thursday night when I saw him again. I hadn't expected it. I had gone to grab a drink with a few coworkers, trying to push him from my mind, try to remind myself that life existed beyond him. And then, there he was, at the other end of the bar, laughing at something his friend said, his head tilted back slightly, eyes crinkling at the corners. For a second, I thought maybe he had moved on, that the night we shared had meant nothing to him. And then his gaze flickered to me, and the laughter died on his lips. My chest tightened. He froze, just for a second, before turning back to his friend, taking a long sip of his drink, pretending he hadn't seen me. But he had. I knew it. I felt it. And suddenly, the air in the room was thick again, just like that night in my apartment. I clenched my jaw, debating whether to approach him, whether to demand something, anything from him. An answer, a reaction, even just a sign that I hadn't imagined the way he kissed me. But before I could move, he was already leaving. Not in a rush, not in a panic, but with purpose, like he had seen me and made a decision, like he wasn't ready to face what had happened, like he never would be. And I was left there, gripping my glass so tightly it might break, watching him walk away again. I should have let him go. I should have sat back down, finished my drink, and convinced myself that this, whatever this was, had never mattered in the first place. But I couldn't. Not after the way he had looked at me. Not after the way he had kissed me. Not after the way he had run. So I followed him. Out of the bar, past the neon lights that bled color onto the wet pavement, past the slow-moving cars and the groups of people laughing on the sidewalk, past everything except the single thought hammering in my head. I can't let him walk away again. He was a few steps ahead, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear. He hadn't noticed me yet. Or maybe he had, and he just didn't want to turn around. Daniel. His steps faltered. For a second, I thought he might keep walking. But then he stopped, exhaling sharply before turning to face me. His eyes were unreadable, dark, guarded. I took a step closer. Are we really going to pretend nothing happened? His jaw tightened. I don't know what you're talking about. Bullshit. I huffed out a dry laugh. Right. So what? You kissed me by accident. His hands curled into fists to the sides. I was drunk. You weren't that drunk. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that pressed between us like a wall. I wanted to tear it down. I wanted to shake him, to demand answers, to make him admit that he felt it too, that whatever had happened that night wasn't just some stupid mistake. But I could see it in his face. The fear, the doubt, the war raging inside him. And I knew that no matter what I said, no matter how badly I wanted this, he wasn't ready. So I swallowed the anger, the frustration, the ache in my chest that had been there since the moment he walked out of my apartment. And I asked him the only question that mattered. What are you so afraid of? His breath hitched. For a split second, something flashed in his eyes. Something raw, something real, something I wasn't supposed to see. And then he turned, and he walked away. Again, leaving me standing there in the rain, heart pounding, stomach twisted, wondering if he'd ever stop running, or if I was the one who needed to let him go.